Larry Harmon, a lifelong Ohioan who has lived in the same house near Akron for 16 years, never gave his voting registration a second thought.
I've been voting since 1976. A couple times I didn't vote. If I felt I wasn't up on the issues or I couldn't really decide who was worse of the two candidates, I just wouldn't vote.
Harmon voted in the 2008 presidential election, but sat out the 2012 race. Then, last November, the 59-year-old software engineer and Navy veteran arrived at his polling place, this high school, to vote on a ballot initiative that he worried would allow monopolies to control legalized marijuana in Ohio.
I went down there to vote against it, and my name wasn't on the list. And I couldn't vote.
Harmon was removed from the rolls of eligible voters in 2015 because he had not voted in the previous 6 years. When it comes to the right to vote, Ohio is a use it or lose it state. Just last year, Ohio's 20 most populous counties purged more than 200,000 inactive voters, according to research by PBS NewsHour Weekend. In Ohio's largest county, Cuyahoga, with heavily Democratic Cleveland, nearly 52,000 voters were purged.
I thought, well, geez, I pay my taxes every year, and I pay my property taxes, and I register my car, so the state had to know I'm still a voter. Why should we fight for the country if they're going to be taking away my rights? I mean, I'm a veteran, my father is a veteran, my grandfather's a veteran. Now they aren't giving me my right to vote, the most fundamental right I have? I just can't believe it.
In Ohio, the Secretary of State sends out this form, warning voters who have not cast ballots in 2 years to confirm their eligibility or risk having their voting registrations canceled. The practice has been state law under Democrats and Republicans for more than 20 years.
Ohio Secretary of State John Husted, a Republican who served 2 terms as Speaker of Ohio's State House, has increased enforcement of the practice.
As Secretary of State, is it your mission to ensure that as many people as possible vote in Ohio?
My goal is to strike the balance between making it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
Husted says it's his legal duty to make sure voting rolls stay up to date and don't become bloated with voters who have died or residents who've left Ohio, like college students.
Don't I have the right to vote whenever I choose? If I don't want to vote for 20 years, isn't that perfectly fine?
It's perfectly fine if you don't, but you just have to re-register.
Husted says the state maintains the accuracy of its voting list in 2 ways. First, by using the National Post Office database. But many people don't register their new addresses when they move. That's when the second process, known as purging, kicks in.
You're inactive for 2 years, meaning that you've not voted, you've not done anything. We send you a card to say, hey, are you still registered to vote? Are you still living at this address?
To stay on the voter rolls, residents have 4 years to respond to the letter and confirm their address, or simply vote, or they can sign a petition, the kind that requires signatures from registered voters. Harmon says he doesn't remember receiving the form in the mail, so after being turned away from his polling place last year, he joined a lawsuit brought by the American Civil Liberties Union and the public policy group Demos against Secretary of State Husted, challenging Ohio's purge process. Attorney Dan Takaji, who's a co-counsel on the lawsuit, says Ohio's law violates the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, better known as the Motor Voter Bill, which requires states to improve opportunities to register to vote, such as when applying for a driver's license.
If the state has other reasons for believing somebody has moved, for example, if they get information from the post voters, what neither Ohio nor any other state can do is to initiate the purge process solely because of a registered voter's failure to vote.
But Ohio did. 6 other states, Alaska, Montana, South Dakota, Tennessee, Georgia, and West Virginia, also consider voter inactivity when striking names from lists of registered voters.
Do many of these folks not know that they have been purged?
Many of them will not realize that they've actually been removed from the rolls until they go to vote. We think that the biggest impact is going to be felt in urban areas, especially places where you've got less affluent voters.
Ohio has removed infrequent voters off the voter roll.
Community organizer Andre Washington is spreading the word about Ohio's voting rules at Tridestone Baptist Church, one of Columbus's largest predominantly black churches. He has also joined the lawsuit against the Secretary of State.
Most of the people that they purged look like me and you.
Washington fears Ohio's purge practice will disenfranchise African Americans who have not voted since 2008, when they helped elect the first black president.
So what we're going to do is check to make sure that you're registered.
So after Sunday services, these volunteers helped congregants check the Secretary of State's public records to see if they are still registered.
It's very important that these people that were purged get put back on the rolls so that they can exercise their right to vote. Because one of the jobs of the Secretary of State is to make sure that the ballot box is accessible to all citizens of Ohio and make sure it's easier for them to vote, not harder for them to vote.
Does this policy disenfranchise poor African Americans?
It actually has no race, gender, ethnicity component to it, because it treats every single voter exactly the same. And remember, if you receive one of these cards, it's because you haven't voted.
You don't think it's an unfair burden requiring people who haven't voted for a while to make some kind of affirmative statement?
The law says it's 6 years. The federal court agreement says it's 6 years. I can understand people who have policy disagreements. If you want to make it longer, change the law, I'll follow the law.
Ohio's purge of inactive voters is among several election rules under fierce legal attack here. In May, a federal judge reinstated 7 days of early voting when same-day registration is also allowed, known as Golden Week. The Republican state legislature eliminated it 2 years ago in a law signed by Ohio's Republican governor, John Kasich, reducing the number of early voting days to 28. But the judge found the early voting rollback discriminatory because black voters are more likely than white voters to cast ballots early and in person. In June, another federal judge struck down laws allowing Ohio election officials to use trivial errors to disqualify absentee ballots and provisional ballots, the ones voters fill out when their registrations are challenged at polling places. For example, a voter registered as William Thomas Smith could have his absentee ballot rejected because he wrote the abbreviation W.T. Smith or Bill Smith on his envelope. Civil rights groups had argued those rejections amounted to an unconstitutional literacy test.
If you take these together, your opponents would argue that the intent is to suppress Democratic votes.
Well, that's nonsense, and they know it is. Many of them have actually voted for the same policies that I am enacting. I mean, I adopt the same directives that my Democratic predecessor was using, but Democrats now call that voter suppression. It's almost, in the history of the world, never been easier to vote anywhere than it is in Ohio today.
Ever since the bitterly contested 2000 presidential election, where lawyers fought over Florida's disputed ballots, all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, legal maneuvering over voting rules has intensified. For example, 17 states have laws now in effect requiring photo identification in order to vote, all but 2 of those states led by Republicans when the laws passed. The number of lawsuits nationwide over voting practices and results has also dramatically increased, from only 80 cases in 1999 to more than 300 in 2014, a trend Ohio State University professor Edward Foley calls the voting wars.
So the voting wars is to use the tools of the legal system to try to give one side or the other a little bit of an advantage on election day in the counting of the ballots. And it can be through lawsuits, or it can be through creating new laws that you think might be favorable to your side.
Foley says both parties are constantly fighting over what he calls the margin of litigation, legal skirmishes that could change outcomes in close races.
In battleground states, the chances are that the election could be really close. 1,000 votes could tip a state. So the rules for how you count disputed ballots really matter, could determine who wins a state like Ohio.
And the stakes are high here.
Stakes are the White House.
In the voter purge case, last month a federal judge ruled in favor of Secretary of State Houston, saying the purge process does not violate the National Voter Registration Act and the public interest is being served by the procedure. Lawyers representing Larry Harmon and other Ohio voters have appealed, and 2 weeks ago, the Department of Justice asked the court to reverse its decision. Knowing the stakes in Ohio, Harmon has already re-registered. Are you planning to vote in this November's election?
Yes, I am.